Okay, we're going to go ahead and draw out this picture right here. It's just a simple Outer Banks scene. The sand buried over the steps, the shifting sand when it gets stormy out down there, and then there's a little bit of dead grass, but pretty simple. Water way in the background. We're going to give it a shot. Now, what I'm going to do is just put a horizon line straight across with my T-square. Just make it somewhat straight. It's way high up, and that'll give us a start. Let's put it in real light. About right there. There ain't gonna be much sky. Okay, we're done with that. Now what I'm gonna do is start drawing in right here. This should be the water. What I'm also gonna use is, I got this from Amazon just to hold it. And what I'm going to do is make some of my straight lines with it. They would start about right in here. So we're going to give it a shot. Just to keep them parallel. This helps a lot. I put the link down below from Amazon. It's only a few bucks. But it's really nice that you can hold on to it and then just slide it around. You don't have to try and grab it all the time and get underneath it. You can move it around. And when you're doing a lot of parallel lines, architecture, any kind of drawing for a watercolor just to get you started, works very well. Now some of these grasses over here, I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go back and put lighter stripes in it. I could put some of the frisket down just to block them off and mask it off, but I don't know if I could get my frisket thin enough because I want it to be in proportion, otherwise they'll look too heavy and too cartoonish, for lack of better words. If I make them real thin, real fine, I might be better off mixing down a white with a little bit of quinacridone gold and then go back over top of some of them once I'm done with everything. And then this is all going to be just colors. This is going to be the water here. That's about it. We're ready to start. There's really not too much else I could draw. Let's go ahead and start painting. Okay, the only thing I'm going to do is put a little bit of the top of the rails on. And we will do that just like this. And then I'm going to clean up the drawing with my eraser. Okay, let's mix up our sky color. Use a little bit of cobalt, and just to gray it down just a little bit, I'm going to use a little bit of burnt umber. I'll wash it down pretty good. There's our gray. Since the sky is lighter than the ocean, I could run it right into the ocean, but I want to be careful when I start carving out my waves. They have to be fairly small since this is an ocean that's way in the background. Okay, we're going to start out with some grayish blues again, but then since the ocean is somewhat turbulent, it goes down into a little bit more of a grayish. That's just the sand being churned up. And I could also go back in and just put in some little small highlights of the waves later. Okay, we'll leave that dry. Okay, let's get ready to add some more color here. We're going to put some more oranges, quinacridone golds, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna here and there. And then over here we'll make this just like the lower right. And we'll just use bits and pieces and let some of the water and the color do its thing also. And get some interesting patterns going here. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to wet down the area. And this way I could start a wash that will just be non-stop. Some of these places, if I could keep the bead going around everything, that works really good also. But if you could do a water wash, that's a safe way. This will soak down the paper, give me a chance to add some more colors here and there while it's still wet. I'm going to make this just a little wee bit lighter. I'll darken the background. That'll push it back a little bit. Well, we should have a bigger brush, but that's okay. Now I'm almost done. Okay, let's start with, mix up that burnt sienna, and we're going to add a little bit of quinacridone gold to it. I'm going to make it real light. A lot of water. And I'm just going to try and add some texture here and there, just so it's just on a plain color wash. And it's just a very thin wash of cobalt blue and burnt umber. Remember, obviously, in this type of paintings, we don't have to do the photograph exactly, but I do like to keep some of the intricacies of just what happens with the sand as it blows around. And this will lighten up and feather out a good bit. Then later on, after it dries, I'll do some script work of some of these dark lines that are very interesting. And then I'm going to water it down quite a bit and do this. Just a couple of streaks here and there from the windswept sand. Barely be able to see them by the time they dry. And while it's still wet, sometimes you have to work with something like this, only because if it's too wet, your subtle highlight will just run back together. But if it's too dry, you won't be able to lift it out. And if the highlights are fairly small or subtle, sometimes it's easier just to put down an entire wash and then go back in and pull out the highlights rather than try and paint around them. And it'll be a different type of highlight too. It'll be a soft edge highlight versus a real hard edge highlight like that little dot right there. Okay, we can start putting in some dark patches here and there. I'll leave this right here as the top of one cloud. It's kind of broken up, overcast. Low cloud ceiling towards the horizon. And sometimes if I scrub something out, even towards the horizon, I'll wait till it dries, and then if I need to straighten out an edge or two or something like that, then I will do that after it dries, because it'll just keep on bleeding together if I don't. But we'll lift a little wee bit of that out and just make the horizon a little bit brighter. Okay, we'll put a little bit of texture and build up some shapes in the foreground water. Waves breaking in. Now if I want a sharp edge up here where the curl is coming over, it might be a sharper edge, but then where the water comes down and goes into the flat part, that might be a little bit more of a transition. So just keep that gradient alive. I'll break up one edge but leave the other. Just taking bits and pieces out of the photo. This water is quite a distance away, so. And I'm making the water towards the shore a little bit grayer, only because it's probably stirred up with sand, and it's not that real vivid blue. Overcast, the waves are crashing. If I leave myself enough white, when I first blocked in the waves, then I could go back in and break a little bit of them up just to make it look like turbulent water. We'll let that dry. Okay, I'm going to put a couple more washes right in here just to make this a little bit darker, but just to give it some texture also. I'll make this darker up in here, and then we got a good ways to go on this right here. So what we will do is start adding some more oranges. I'll use a bigger brush for this just to scumble in some color. Working in with the quinacridone gold and the burnt sienna, I'm just still blocking in some of the bigger shapes. I want to make sure that foreground sand dune is dark enough so I could end up with my white colored grass. Working in a little bit of the distant water and beach, I'll move back into the handrail itself, but I'll use my Winsor Newton Series 995. This particular brush has a very sharp edge that will make an irregular straight line for me, unlike a perfect line made by a liner brush. After these layers dry, I'll go back in with some more pure colors just to make it characterized or stylized like a classic watercolor. I want the wood to be dry, weathered gray, but I could still add a snap of color to them here and there. Now I'm working on the foreground sand dune, and again, I have to make sure I have enough dark colors down that I could then put my opaque white mixed with my quinacridone gold on top of everything as the first and foremost blades of grass that will be near the viewer. Working back into the sand dune itself, I'm putting in a little bit of the script work of where the sand falls over, and then also the subtle textures involved, just to add a little bit of complexity to what would be considered a bland flat color. There will be textures involved, but they're not going to be eye-grabbing like the strong contrast of the grass in the foreground, or the handrail that will make up the subject matter of this particular painting. Now working back into the ocean, I'll slowly block in my waves and move on to the next. Still working with the beach area, sometimes I make things a little bit darker than I need. I may put a slight whitewash over some of the areas. It has a completely different look when you see the painting versus leaving it white. That chalky look that you get sometimes you may want. Now I'm just going back into the ocean and making the curls of the waves stand out a little more. Again, I'm making that area on the right darker than it needs to be so I can take my light colored grass back over it. Working back into the sky, I'm just trying to make the foreground a little bit darker to push back the horizon line. Leaving it a little bit lighter than the foreground should push it back. Now just working in some white highlights here and there, going back over the sand and the water. I'll soon start the grass, and what I wanted to do is actually just start putting in some of the lighter colored grass here and there. There are a lot of different angles and a lot of variations of colors. Again, that will be the light back over the dark. Let's see what we got. Okay, let's take a look. I could even make the sky even just a little bit darker, but I think I do like it darker on top. I can work a little bit more colors in, but what I'm going to do is make a little bit of dark lines down here. That's my liner brush, and I'm going to get a real heavy mix of French ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and then I'm going to take some real thin lines just right up through here, almost like the shadows of the ones that I already made, just to crisscross over some, just to make it look a little bit more complicated than it really is. I might even put a little bit just to brown it down. A little bit of burnt sienna in some of these. I'm going to try and make these as fine as possible, only because then that will be hopefully what will grab somebody's attention first, is just the real fine lines. Then it kind of tends to look more detailed than it really is. If I put a lot of water in it, it will flood and make it wider than I really want. If I don't put enough in, then it'll start to skip. So I'm trying to get in between and make a heavy line, but a very opaque line, but not too thick. And then some of these lines, you could see lower right hand corner of my reference, there's some really dark blades that are just dried out from the end of the season, so to speak. But one thing I did want to show you, this right here is actually a tuft of grass that got stuck up against the post as the tide was going out. I went down here, Outer Banks, right after Hurricane Sandy. It was quite some time ago of this particular reference, and I always wanted to paint some of these, but that is why the steps are buried, because the tidal surge comes in and actually pulls in all kind of sand, but then as it goes back out, all kind of things get caught on vertical surfaces. So it's kind of interesting sometimes what could be going on inside your reference as to what's going on. Again, just going over certain areas just to try and add a complexity. Just squiggly script lines. Again, make everything look more complicated than it really is. But I made some of the grass pretty high, but I just went with it. I'm going to make some darker ones up in here. Just here and there. It doesn't have to be a full blade. It can be just the shadowed areas of some that are already there. And how they cross over each other sometimes makes a difference. If you want to add depth to the painting. Let's take a couple wee light blue washes back over the sky just here and there, and that might be it. A little bit more blue. I'm just going to use the same brush. I really don't have nothing to go by here, so I'm just picking some areas out. But then I'll water them down. I want my sharp edges on the bottom just to define the cloud's tops. What I'm doing is trying to paint around the top of the clouds, but also overall to make everything in the foreground sky a little bit darker. Now if I want, I still have a little bit of white out. I'm going to take a little bit of it, just go right across the top of the water, just to see what that does. Didn't change it a lot, but I thought I'd try it. I'm actually trying to cover up my pencil line here more than anything. I'll leave it like that. I'll take one last hit of good strong white right here. There we go. Okay, with everything all said and done, some of the just real dark things that wash up the shore and get tangled up in layers of sand as the water goes in and out. But again, that was pretty bad storm down there that I was actually traveling on temporary roads that they had set up. Even a couple of bridges were washed out. So it was an interesting experience to see the shoreline right after a pretty strong hurricane. The way things are now, I think we changed some things here and there, adjusted some things. I could actually go in and just make one last thing. Go back in and just put some lighter lines in this, just to give it some kind of a texture instead of just that bland black. As I mix the burnt umber and French ultramarine blue, pretty strong. There we go, I'll leave it like that. Okay, our driftwood railing on the steps buried. A little bit of sand dune action, a little bit of grass, and a distant ocean. Just by going by our reference, what we have now, I'll leave this one go at that. And we'll call this one done. And until I see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.